Well, welcome
You're live now.
everyone. Welcome everyone. We're gonna wait a couple of seconds as everyone gets admitted into the room, and then we'll start the presentation. All right, well, good evening. My name is Adam Piskowski, and I'm a principal planner with the City of Morgan Hill with the Long Range Planning Division. And so tonight is a town hall meeting regarding the draft housing element for the 2023-2031 update. And so tonight there's a couple topics that I'm just going to briefly talk about. Just for anyone's benefit who's not familiar with the housing element, I'll briefly discuss what we are talking about, why we're having this meeting tonight. I'll briefly go over all the components that are part of the housing element, and why does the housing element matter to our community? Why does it matter to you, the residents, as well as the city as a whole? And then I'll go over something that's called our goals for the housing element. So we do have 7 goals that were identified throughout our preparation of the housing element. And then I'll end my presentation, open it up for any comments for anyone who wants to submit verbal comments on the housing element or the draft housing element. And then we would also allow for time for any questions that anyone has about the housing element as well. So first, I just want to say that a housing element is how local jurisdictions plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. And at its core, a housing element is an opportunity to have a community conversation about how to address local housing challenges and find solutions. The housing element is one important part of a city or county's general plan, which serves as a blueprint for how a city or county will grow and address change in needs for development as we grow or as time passes by. So every 8 years, every city, town, and county must update their housing element and have it certified by the state through the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So we are working on the 2023-2031 housing element update, which is referred to as the 6th cycle. And this must be approved by the city and submitted to the state for approval prior to our deadline of January 31st, 2023. So there are several components of the housing element. So these are the main ones. The first bullet point is the housing needs assessment. So this is our census information about the city. So it examines demographic, employment, as well as housing trends that affects our housing needs in our city. The next bullet point I have listed on here is a sites inventory. So a sites inventory identifies locations of available sites for housing development or even redevelopment to ensure that there is an adequate capacity to address something that's called the regional housing needs allocation. So the regional housing needs allocation is the number of housing units we must build as directed by the state. And these housing units are broken into different categories for all income groups. So it's the low housing to your market rate housing. The third bullet point is something that's called the evaluation of past performance. So it's just a way of saying, how do we do in our current or our prior housing element? So we measure how have we grown in the past 8 years? What policies and programs do we have in that the previous housing element? And what did we achieve? What did we accomplish during that time period? The fourth one is the policies and programs. And so we must establish policies and programs or actions to fulfill our goals for the housing element. So we must identify both telling the community as well as the state, what's our plan, what's our work program for housing for the next 8 years. And then the second to last bullet point is something called constraints analysis. So the state requires us to analyze and recommend remedies for existing and potential governmental as well as non-governmental barriers to housing development. So anything that could that's considered or can add to the cost of housing, that must also be analyzed in the housing element. And then the last bullet point is our community outreach and engagement. So we must implement a community outreach program, and the state is requiring that we have a particular focus on outreach to traditionally underrepresented groups, and that's for all throughout California. So every city within California must conduct this type of work and develop a housing element. So one of the other things, this kind of falls underneath the housing needs assessment, is something new. It's called the Affirmatively Further and Fair Housing. So this housing element is unique compared to previous years because cities are held more accountable to their housing plan by the state and must address fair housing rights. In 2018, California adopted new requirements for jurisdictions to affirmatively further fair housing, or AFFH for short. And while it has long been illegal for cities to discriminate based on race or certain other categories, the AFFH rules go further and require that cities actively work to dismantle the legacy of segregation and to create equal housing opportunities. So now cities are expected to study housing demographics more thoroughly, in particular, identifying how the needs and trends are different for people of color and other protected groups. We must ensure that public engagement reaches all segments of the community. We must plan so that new housing is not disproportionately put in low-income communities or low-income communities of color. And then we also have to develop policies and programs that advance equity. So these are all, this is a new requirement, and this is the first time it's being required for cities during this housing element update. So why does this matter? So first off, the housing element is mandated by state law, and it is part of the city's general plan. So that's, again, going back to that blueprint on how we would grow for the next 8 years. And talking about that 8 years, it outlines the city's strategy specifically for housing and how it will comprehensively address the existing as well as the projected housing needs of everyone in the city. And that's for the years 2023 to 2031. And then the last bullet point I have on here is just really quantifying what's considered affordable housing. So in housing elements, a lot of talk is about what's affordable housing, how many units or affordable housing units must be built in a city in the next 8 years. And to put it into perspective on the dollar amount, so anyone who has a family of 4 that makes $200,000 now qualifies for affordable housing. And then the table on the bottom here is that regional housing needs allocation. So it's the number of housing units that must be built within Morgan Hill. So in the next 8 years. So the total here is 1,037 units or housing units that must be built in the future or the next 8 years. So next, I just want to talk about the housing element goals, just list those here. So through the development of the housing element, we conducted outreach, met with a lot of different groups. We reached out to those hard to hit segments of the community, people that don't normally attend public planning commission meetings or city council meetings. So we actively went out and met with them, as well as community-based organizations. And so through that, we also conducted surveys that some of you may have completed, which help guide what those goals are. So the 7 goals, the first one is provide a diversified housing stock to meet the full range of future community housing needs. The second one was a major one. It's I'll read it first. So it's to encourage extremely low income, or ELI, housing production, increasing availability of affordable and workforce housing. So extremely low income is people or families that make 30% area median income or less. So it's providing housing for those extremely low income households. This is the type of housing within all housing elements that's the hardest to build, because it's for that 30% area median income. And so it's something that we want to strive to achieve. It's the one income category that's hard for every city to build for, but throughout this process, we want to encourage producing that type of housing. Goal number 3 is advance equity, inclusion throughout the city. So this is relating back to that affirmatively further and fair housing requirement. Goal 4 is preserve and rehabilitate existing housing supply. Goal 5 is promote housing for people experiencing homelessness. Goal 6 is provide adequate housing for groups with special needs. And then the last one is increase community outreach and promote education of affordable housing. So some of these goals were carried over from the previous housing element. Some of them were a little bit modified, but we did have a couple new ones. So for example, goals 2 and 3, those were new for this coming year, as well as the last goal 7, which is increase community outreach and education. And so when we're going through this process with the housing element update, we realize that there's a lot more outreach that we can do, and as well as education about what is affordable housing. So I'm wrapping up my short presentation because we want to open it up for public comments, just to receive any verbal comments from anyone who's attending today. So next steps, we will be going to the Planning Commission in July for a recommendation to submit this draft housing element to the City Council in August, and then get direction from City Council to submit the draft to the state of California for their review. And the state is going to have a 90-day review period. That's in the state law now. So they have 3 months to review our draft element and make any comments with that. And then after that process, we'll bring it back to City Council for a final review and approval before we adopt the housing element. And so that time period will probably be December or January, right, when our deadline is due. So anyone who's listening tonight that's not ready to submit any comments on the actual draft housing element, I have my email address listed here. So you got Adam Piskowski at morganhill.ca.gov. So you can always email me comments as well. We are accepting comments up until July 5th. And then after that, we'll be going to the Planning Commission for a recommendation. We also have our website listed here for the housing element update. So on that page, there's additional information about what is the housing element, as well as links to download the draft housing element and all the appendices. And then the last link down here is Let's Talk Housing Santa Clara County. So this is more of a regional website. So if you're interested in other cities in Santa Clara County, such as Gilroy or San Jose, you can go to that link and find additional information to access other cities' housing elements, or even any additional meetings that other cities will be doing for their housing element update. So with that, we are going to open it up for comments, and then also for anyone who has any questions about the housing element that we can address. So we want to really hear from you and hear what your feedback is, or if there's any questions that you may have. If anyone needs any suggestions, I guess we're looking for input on the draft housing element. Basically, what types of housing would be good for Morgan Hill? If there's certain policies or actions that you want to see Morgan Hill grow in the next 8 years, that would be good feedback to receive tonight, as well as any comments or specific comments on the actual policies or actions that are in our housing element, our draft housing element. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to anyone in the attendees who wishes to speak. And I guess if maybe Angie, if you can inform people how they can raise their hand and be called upon.
Yes, if you are on your phone, you could dial *9 to raise your hand, or you could go to the icon at the bottom that says raise your hand. And Adam, we do have a question in the Q&A if you wanted to take a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
I can grab that one, Adam. Good evening, everyone. Rebecca Garcia, Housing Director. So this question is, how can community clinics network with your program to refer our patients? So we recently just did a housing search town hall that we recorded, and I'd be happy to share it with you, but it gives folks a good idea, a quick snapshot of the housing programs that we offer. And most importantly, which we find a lot of people are looking for, is how do they search for housing in today's market? So we're happy to put that link on there. I will also put my contact information and Christy Thomas's contact information. We're happy to also meet with you offline and go over some ways we can connect. And we have a variety of different brochures that we can share with you as well.
And we have one person raising their hand, and I'll allow them to speak now.
I don't know if I can be heard, but I'd like to make a comment.
Yes, we can hear you.
My name, you can't hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your service to our community. Much appreciated. My name is Salerno. I'm in the Jackson Oaks neighborhood, and I only have a few minutes to review this housing element plan. Let me ask you a dumb question. I'm a retired federal employee, and I've only been here 12 years. I don't see under restrictions or constraints, government and non-government. For the last 7 years, sir, 6 of those years we've had insufficient water and we have insufficient electricity. Wouldn't this qualify as a non-government constraint? To me, if we don't have enough water for 40,000 residents, why are we even considering building additional commercial and residential units? There's 40,000 people in Morgan Hill. We don't have enough water. We're currently under a 20% water reduction. If we have unabated housing, what are we going to do? Tell people to only bathe once a week, use the toilet every other day? I mean, we have to have some constraints. I'm told Morgan Hill, from the water district itself, is the only town or community in Santa Clara County where 100% of our water comes from ground wells, supplemented by Lake Anderson. If you haven't noticed, they closed Lake Anderson for the next 10 years for retrofit. Ground wells will not get additional water from Lake Anderson. So we have to rely 100% on rainfall. It's been substandard. Why is this not in your plan? And why is the city of Morgan Hill not asking for an exemption from the state law? Your comments, sir?
You're muted.
Jennifer, you're muted.
I'll actually step in and attempt to answer your question, sir. So water and electricity that has been, and it's not the electricity that's available, it is the consistency of our electricity. All of those infrastructure standards have been a challenge over the last few years. However, the planning for water has been such that we are covered in the city, and our recent urban water master plan shows that we do have capacity for the population that's planned for in our general plan. We are looking at ways to be more efficient. There are state orders to be more efficient, as well as county orders to be more efficient. And so that's where you're seeing that 20%, because we're instituting that within the city as well. You ask why we're not asking for an exemption. The state currently does not allow cities to stop building or do a moratorium or do anything like that without housing and community development's approval. And that's what we always call it, HCD. So the state would have to approve any sort of stoppage. And that, we believe, is going to be very challenging. And at this point in our existence or progress, I think as we move forward in the drought and conditions may change, whether for the worse or for the better, then there may be some opportunity to look at those options of talking with the state. But as of right now, we're not in a condition where HCD would grant such a request. And so it hasn't been requested. We know that, so. So it looks like we have another Q&A question. Do projects currently in process, for example, the Devco project on Hill Road in Barrett, apply to the 2022/future housing requirements or past requirements? And so, Adam, I don't know if you want to talk about when we count units, or I'll turn that over to you.
Sure. So for all projects, when do they, I guess, so the question is, when do projects, or when our housing units are built, when do they count towards our housing element, towards our RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment or allocation? So as part of that process, it's not when there's a plan and entitlement, like we have several in process now, but it's actually when the housing unit is actually built. So it's when it has the building permit finalized. So when it's ready for occupancy. And so for occupancy, it's during this time period, it's anything that is built or actually finalized and ready to be occupied after July 1st, 2022. So in a couple of weeks, or actually just over a week from now, we'll be able to start counting any new housing units that are built after July 1st towards our next 8 years. So it'll be from 2023 through 2031. Any housing units that get their final building permits or that are finalized before June 30th or within this next week, then they would count for our current cycle, which is from 2015 to 2022.
We do have another speaker. I'll allow him to talk now.
Good evening. This is Doug Muirhead, Morgan Hill resident. I would like to address this new focus on equity, inclusion, and diversity. I'm primarily interested in definitions and measures of success, so this comment might actually be more relevant after you get your housing element approved and you move on to implementation, but I want to get it out on the table anyway. You state that the city's ambition is to create equitable and inclusive neighborhoods where residents are served by transit, recreational amenities, shopping, and health and personal services. And so I'm interested in how we're going to convey where we stand and where we're going on those three categories, and dividing up the city. I won't call them neighborhoods, let's call them zones, so that we can sort of understand what we believe we already have with respect to these categories, and then how far we are from goals. So because I'm more visual than verbal, my concept would be some kind of dashboard or graphic that use the how far are we from the goal thermometers. And so each of these zones have 3 thermometers for the 3 categories. And behind the thermometers would be the actual metrics that you're using. So I find this a very interesting topic. I think it's a very challenging topic. So I'm very interested in how you're going to move forward in this, but I wanted to get out on the table now that these terms, equity, inclusion, and diversity, are being widely used by jurisdictions. And yet, for the most part, we really don't know what you mean by each of those terms, whether you have a narrow definition or a broader definition. So at the risk of repeating myself, I'll stop now. Thank you for your presentation this evening.
Sorry about that. Part of the housing element is an evaluation of past performance. And that's a major chapter of the element that we have to create. So the suggestion that we would have some sort of performance measure, I think will lend to our next housing element. And when we have to write that chapter, and I don't know, Rebecca, if you had any thoughts since you wrote that chapter this time of how you might measure that.
Yeah, good evening, Doug. I echo Jen's comments. And so diversity, equity, inclusivity, really important themes that you'll notice are woven throughout the entire document. But really, as staff, for us to, be able to do, as you say, which is, okay, how are we actually doing in these areas? Every year we report on where we're at with every single goal and policy that we're, striving to achieve every single year. So that's really how we hold ourselves accountable to, is through that annual performance report that we submit to HCD in April of every year. But I think we can think on that question some more. It's a big question. And I know, Assistant City Manager Edith Ramirez is also spearheading some work on diversity and equity. And so I think the two will merge at some point. So we'll be thinking on it.
There is another question in the Q&A.
Okay, it seems that we are between a rock and a hard place. The state is mandating housing, while the water district is demanding cuts in water usage. Can the city coordinate with other cities, counties, and water districts to put an initiative on the ballot that would be more realistic on housing demands during an extreme drought?
I mean,
Rebecca, any thoughts?
I think it's a struggle between the reality that we're in a housing crisis and so many folks are literally living outside without a home or doubled up or tripled up or living in a garage. So certainly water is at the forefront of our mind. I imagine the state is balancing that with the fact that there is a tremendous housing shortage and that impacts everything in terms of people's quality of life and transportation. And so I don't see that happening in the near future, but as Jen mentioned earlier, it would be the state HCD that would be the only ones that could allow us any kind of exemption. And that's not the message we're hearing from them at this point. That could change at some point in time, I don't know.
And if there was any movement on such an initiative, I would expect that to start in Southern California, based on some of the other cities that were also facing challenges with their recent housing element. Some of those cities have actually filed suit against the state and challenged things. They have not been successful, but I would expect that we would hear some talk about such an effort starting there. But you never know, and we keep our ears to what the trends are and what we're hearing from other cities and counties that we work with. And if there was something in the works, we would hear about it. So.
And Salerno, I'll allow you to speak.
I don't know if I can be heard. I've got a terrible connection here. Can you hear me?
Yes, okay.
First of all, I don't mean to be argumentative. I think we need to look at what we can and cannot do. Ms. Carmen's comments that we have plenty of water is not true. We are under a 20% reduction now. We're not allowed to water our lawns, wash our cars, and so on. I think it could get worse. Ms. Carmen is right in that aspect. We don't know what the next 2 or 3 years are going to be, but we do know Morgan Hill is the exception in this county. 100% of our water supply comes from wells supplemented by Lake Anderson. Lake Anderson is closed. I don't know about other cities filing suit against the state, but that's the sole source of our water. If we don't have enough water for 40,000 people, we can't even begin to think about adding more commercial and residential facilities here in our town. I'm not saying don't build. I'm not saying we don't want to be inclusive. I think we have a beautiful community, and I welcome everyone to come down here. I'm also hearing we have the safest community in our county. But if we don't have enough water, then we have to turn around and challenge the state and say, we can't keep asking people to cut back on water. It's going to be improbable and undoable. I get a water report every month, and it says I'm a water saver. I'm on almost a half-acre of land up here in Jackson Oaks. I go out of my way to save water. When it comes to energy, I guess I'm average. I want to do my part, but we don't have enough water. And if the state or county is mandating us building these facilities, we should consider a lawsuit against the county and state. It's that simple. There's not enough water. So I'm sorry to be argumentative. and disagree with you folks, but we need to take a good hard look at our water situation and our energy situation. Mr. Puskowski, there's an electrical plant north of Monterey. It's on the west side of 101. A PG&E plant?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of your
There's
question.
an electrical station north of Morgan Hill on the west side of 101. If you're traveling into San Jose, you can't help see it because the wires go over 101. But I'm wondering if that electrical facility can be expanded to help meet our energy needs. They cut off electrical in the last 8 days here at my home. It lasted both times about between 2 hours and 2 hours and 15 minutes. Has anyone looked into that? We have to find a way, and I'm not talking nuclear like some of these other folks are, but is there any way we can immediately address our energy needs? We'll see how we can address water needs right now, unless Mother Nature provides us adequate rainfall. Again, we don't have Lake Anderson supplement our water wells. Thanks again for hearing me out. I apologize if I seem unprofessional or blunt. That's not my intention. Right now, we don't have enough water, folks. That's the bottom line. Thank you very much.
We appreciate you being here.
We do. And we would love to give you more detailed information about water usage and electricity, but we're not the team that works on that. We have done the housing element. We work on land use and housing issues. And I know we have had infrastructure town halls in the past. We do have infrastructure master plans on our website, including water and electricity and other services. I would strongly advise folks read those plans and to get more information. And we'll relay the concerns we heard tonight to those teams that work on those issues. And perhaps we can schedule another town hall in the future that would address some of those concerns, or at least provide some of that information. I do want to add, we have another comment on the Q&A, which is just a note that most residential water usage goes to lawns and landscaping. New multifamily housing is much more water efficient than most existing housing, especially single family homes. And related to that, one recent ruling that we just received from the water board is we can no longer irrigate turf. And turf in our industrial parks, turf in our commercial areas, all of that is being looked at as to how we're going to replant it, working with the private landowners, what the appearance will be of those areas, but recognizing that, yes, everyone's hitting a reduction. And it is surprising just how much water your single family house uses and what you can cut to really make that reduction. But it does usually involve landscaping, absolutely. So we have another question. Parking for the bike shop was bought by the housing, I'm assuming, division for Morgan Hill. Is that true? Not sure.
Yeah, there is a parking lot that was purchased, land banked essentially with the hopes of developing it into some type of special needs housing possibly. We haven't gotten around to really solidifying a plan on that yet, but yes, it was. It is on our work program to do so.
So I'm going to just talk a little bit until I see a hand or another question come through. A lot of folks have asked why our numbers are low in our arena. Our regional housing needs allocation is just a little bit above what we had last cycle. which was 928 units is what we're supposed to be finishing up this year. And our new RENA is 1,037. Every year, the numbers come down from the state to what's called the COG, or the Council of Governments. And the Council of Governments in the Bay Area is MTC/ABAG. And what that organization does is they develop a formula, and there's what they call the RENA methodology. And that formula determines how those numbers are going to be distributed to all the cities and counties. And so what they did this time is that formula was based around transit and jobs. And because we have a severe lack of transit opportunities in the city that our city team is constantly working on with VTA and Caltrain to get more service into the area. And we don't have that robust job market that balances out the community with the number of people who live here versus the number of jobs we have, our numbers were low. They may not feel low to those of you looking and concerned about housing development, but they are relatively low. If it had been a straight distribution, whether by population or size of the community, we would be looking at a number in the 2,500 to 3,000 range. There are cities north of us who may be slightly smaller who did get those numbers, who have a huge amount of housing that they need to develop, mostly because they do have those transit resources. And you're going to see denser development around transit areas and transit stations. We do have what the state determines to be a transit station in the city. We advocate with the state about that definition because it's not based on service. It's based on the existence only of a train station / platform. And so the team from a legislative standpoint is continuing to work with state agencies and resources, trying to work some sort of compromise or change to the rules that would actually consider service. And that actually might end up even making numbers lower for the next time. So I just wanted to give some more background. We don't talk a lot about this. As a team, we could talk about housing element all day long. We often do. But I want folks who are interested to really understand where we're coming from on it. It is a document that's required every year or every cycle, I should say. The state is making the requirements of this document more prescriptive or mandatory. I have done a number of housing elements, as have Adam and Rebecca. And Christy, I know you've had some experience with them. And every year it's gotten more restrictive about what information had to be in there, what form that information had to be in, and what needed to be communicated as part of the plan. So I'm just providing information, and I'll stop talking if anyone else wants to jump in here. I think we have another question. How is the housing plan addressing the reality that single family units are actually multifamily in use? Often 2 to 3 families per unit, generating 4 to 6 cars per unit. Are EIRs, parentheses, traffic and parking for projects, based on older standards, typically 2 cars per single family unit, or what is really happening today?
Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, why don't actually, Rebecca, if you want to take a hit first at sort of the multi-generational and doubling up issue, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we definitely heard that feedback from the community and lots of folks that we interviewed. And so where we ended is there's a tremendous need for multifamily housing, for rental housing opportunities in the city that are actually reasonably priced. And also, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, that's really what impacts one of the 7 goals that Adam talked about earlier, which was the need for extremely low income housing. Pretty much every conversation we had, and we had a lot of them, there was an overwhelming need for extremely low income housing opportunities that people could afford. those are not single-family homes, and they're not going to be single-family homes. So through this plan, we've tried to make it really clear that we have to focus on creating rental opportunities. I hope that in part answers your question.
From the environmental side, the law recently changed with the California Environmental Quality Act, and where it used to be or traffic operational standards, like level of service, how were intersections impacted, that's no longer part of what's allowed to be analyzed as far as an EIR. Now we look at vehicle miles traveled, and it's more tied to greenhouse gas emissions and air quality than it is to the actual functional aspect of streets. It sounds a little incomprehensible. I think all the planners I know, and Adam may agree or not agree, were like, what just happened when these rules came into place? The city, though, does have a requirement in our general plan that for any project that's going to generate more than 100 trips per peak hour, that we do look at those operational issues from a general plan perspective. And oftentimes now what we're seeing as part of those EIRs is you'll have two separate documents, one that's included in the EIR that does relate back to VMT or vehicle miles traveled, and one that relates back to traffic operations. As far as the multi-tenant or multi-dwelling, I don't really think that is something that would be looked at per se. In addition to that aspect of multi-generational families, groups of people sharing housing together, we do have new laws now that allow up to 4 units on a single family lot. And that is referred to as SB 9. You're allowed to have another principal structure if you can fit it. There's a lot of restrictions, and it depends on where you are in the city and the amount of land you have available. But 2 primary structures and 2 ADUs, and there's or a combo of such. And it is something that I think is going to continue to further impact neighborhoods in the city. And that goes to our transit needs. Morgan Hill is different than communities to the north of us because we don't have the alternative to cars. You can't get to work outside the city without a vehicle. I mean, some people can. There are the buses that go north and Caltrain, 3 trains a day. But generally, you're not going to ride your bike to San Jose. And those who do, I commend you. But it's just not something that most people are going to be able to do. Adam, do you have anything to add on the CEQA issue or traffic?
Not too much, just that the new VMT laws came into effect a couple years ago. And so it's a different way of thinking. For the past, 30 or 40 years, it's always been level of service, LOS. And now all of a sudden we have VMT, the vehicle miles traveled. So it's CEQA stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. And so it's focusing more on that environmental. The traffic, the parking, that's the way how the state refers to it, is that's convenience. It's not environmental. And so that's why there was a change to vehicle miles traveled.
And it's not just difficult for the public to understand, it's difficult for everyone who's worked with this data for years to understand. And so the city is working on their LOS to VMT conversion. We're working with a consultant to help us modify the existing model that the county currently uses to be something that works for us. But what it's doing is actually the VMT aspect of Morgan Hill involves leaving the city, and as of right now. And so that makes those impacts probably a little more intense than they actually are, because we would just like to keep the measurements within the city limits. So.
Yeah, and ultimately, you have multiple families living in one home because they can't afford to live anywhere else right now. So I think, over the next 5+ years, we're going to start to see housing opportunities that are more accessible. And so hopefully that helps that issue a little bit.
So we have another question in the Q&A, so I'll just read the question. It's, I understand the need for extremely low income and low income housing. However, why is the state mandating market rate housing? This doesn't make sense to me, given that the state is actually losing population. Can you shed any light on the state's rationale for mandating continued single family housing rather than letting market supply or demand drive the building? It's a good question on why is the state mandated the market rate housing. So in our arena for this upcoming 8 years, it's about, I want to say it's about 450 units of market rate housing that they are mandating. And the reason why is that there's actually 5 categories of housing that the state mandates. And the way how the state does it is that they want to see a mix of, I would use the word inclusive community where have everyone living in the same area. And it's not focusing just specific type of housing prices in a neighborhood. It's trying to make it all equitable, have a live work type of community where everyone can live there, everyone can shop there, that everyone can be close to each other, as well as all the businesses or stores and offices that everyone goes to. So I think that's their rationale. It'd probably be better to ask HCD, but that's what I believe is their thinking, is trying to just have a really good mix of everything, and making sure that when you look at housing elements, pretty much everyone exceeds throughout the state their market rate housing. So it is a really good question. I guess I'll turn it over to anyone else who has anything else to add.
No,
Just to add some context to that, when the state shifted to a more proactive approach on requiring cities to develop more housing, they figured out that we were short approximately 2 million units over the years because of the propensity for California building single family homes rather than multifamily units. And that is something that stems towards the, how the housing is distributed and what they think we could do. They don't expect all 2 million here. This is across the state. So it is something that we've seen the trends for, and just to go back to the housing elements I've talked about before, when I first worked on a housing element, it was an academic exercise. And it was, what could we do? And how could we fit stuff here? And what might happen? And every cycle, it's gotten more, how are you going to produce it? When is it going to happen? You have to tell us, from the housing element itself to the annual reports that we're required to file. Everything has gotten more complicated and prescriptive as far as requirements as time has gone on.
and scrutinized.
And scrutinized, yes. Yeah, they never read things before. So.
It's a really great point though, because that piece that Fran is speaking about doesn't need a lot of help from us, right? The market takes care of producing that just based on money and economics.
So we have another question. How many floors can Morgan Hill go up or down for housing? Well, that's a great question, because it depends on who you're building the housing for. And we have height restrictions in our code. They vary depending on what zone you're in. But if it's an affordable project, they can request height exceptions. Those height exceptions are limited to the height our fire truck ladder can go, because we can restrict height based on public safety and access to fight a fire in a building. So right now we're looking at, I believe the maximum height would be somewhere around 100 feet. However, the the highest building that we've had requested so far is 68 feet. And that is for an affordable project on Monterey.
And that's how many stories?
Five floors. So All right, and then another Q&A. Thanks for the explanation. My point concern is that mitigations proposed in project CIRs will be significantly undercompensated if they are based on old standards, 2 cars per single family unit versus reality of 4 to 6 cars per unit. This situation applies to all levels of income, even the upper end above moderate income level units. That, I mean, not every house has 4 to 6 cars. I would debate you on that, but you're right. It is based on a standard. However, also with VMT, parking is also no longer an impact under CEQA. And that is also something that the city is struggling with as well. We have cars. We will always have cars until there is a dedicated way to get out of the city. And we're trying to balance those needs, and it impacts all neighborhoods. We're hearing that all over the city, and everyone's looking for solutions to make that better. California, I grew up in California, and our sense of independence is tied to a vehicle for most people who are of a certain age at this point. Kids are a little bit different. We're not seeing the same trends. I know an inordinate amount of people who talk about their children who could get a driver's license and they don't want one. It's changing with the generation as time moves on, but the impacts are still going to be there. And we're trying to figure out the best way to balance what we have to produce and how it functions with the impacts on the surrounding communities, or surrounding neighborhoods, I should say. Oh, one more. You guys have tough jobs. I appreciate all the work you do in an increasingly difficult environment. And we appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will just say that this is not the end. This is part of the requirements of the housing element, as Adam talked about, is we had to release the document for 30 days before it's heard by any body. Planning Commission will be the next to take a look at it at the end of July. Then it will go to City Council. Then we send it on to HCD. So we have 2 more public hearings. We're also happy to meet with folks and talk to folks. So if there are any other questions, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. As you've heard me tonight, I'm happy to talk about this all day long. So just let me know if you would like to chat. Rebecca has been going out and to neighborhood. Rebecca and Christy have been meeting with everyone in Morgan Hill who's requested some time. And we're going to continue to do so through the process, even when the document is with HCD. And that's also part of the requirements that they're adding, is more and more public involvement to make sure as many people hear about this as possible.
And I typed into the chat, we have our next Planning Commission meeting and another public hearing on Tuesday, July 12th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. So hopefully you all can join us there as well if you'd like.
So actually on July 12th, we need to change that date because we will not have a quorum from the Planning Commission.
Oh,
So it's going to be on July 26th.
26th.
July 26th.
Yes.
Correct.
And Tom, you put in thanks, and I also want to voice appreciation for your service. Thank you very much. We appreciate the difficult questions, and we know what the community is struggling with, and we need to hear it. And I appreciate your acknowledgement that we can give you information and we want to try and help, but we can't fix things necessarily here. But we'll definitely put you in contact if you would like with folks who can give you that technical information.
Thank you all for joining us. It's nice that we're not on here by ourselves. We appreciate all the questions and comments.
So these town halls typically end after an hour. So I think we're going to be wrapping it up, and we have one more. I am Tom Tanner. I am a former county planning commissioner, so I get your efforts. And thank you for serving for the county as well, Tom. All right. Well, I guess thank you all for being here tonight. And I don't know, any last comments from anyone on the team?
I guess just the last comment, if no one has seen it yet, you can always go to our website, to our housing element page. I can share my screen really quick. So on here, so we have, if you go through our government page, the departments, and to our plan page, we have our housing element, where you can just go directly to the link or type in the search for housing element update. And on here, we have all of our information about the housing element that we have our public review period open until July 5th. We have our fact sheet. And then also here's all the documents on this page for the housing element. So we have the main document as well as all the appendices. And then we'll also have links on here for the future planning commission as well as city council meetings. So originally, as Rebecca said, we'll have the meeting on July 12th. It's actually gonna be changed to the 26th. So we'll update that. So we'll have a public hearing on July 26th with the planning commission as well. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate all the comments and the questions that we received tonight.
Yeah, one last comment. Please send any letters of support or refute or disagreement or comments. Feel free to email them to Adam. His email is on the website that he just showed you, but it would be great for us to be able to express to our planning commission and to our city council how the community feels about the draft plan. So we are accepting comments until July 5th, team?
Correct.
Cool. On that note, have a good evening.
Thank you all.